welcome to everybody who's on the conversation today. My name is Ryan Conway. As I mentioned, I'm with the Inuit program of the McConnell Foundation, and it's really our pleasure to have this group on the line today to be able to talk through one of our mentoring webinar sessions on this leading through crisis support that Inuit has rolled out in response to COVID. Our host and leader who's going to take us through the session today is Kimberly Nimrava. And we're incredibly fortunate to have Kimberly working with us. She very much is leading us through this crisis with her expertise and her knowledge. Kimberly, of course, is a former senior executive with the Red Cross and has phenomenal experience dealing with everything from wildfires to tsunami, and has graciously let us borrow some of her time to help craft the different supports that we've been able to make available through the Leading Through Crisis module. That includes access to some of the mentors that you're going to hear about and hear from today, as well as different online resources and different supports that we're very happy to offer on inuweave.ca. Before I turn things over to Kimberly and the mentorship team, I would just like to acknowledge that even though we're meeting virtually today, we are in fact feeling that it's very important to acknowledge our traditional territory that the head offices of the McConnell Foundations actually sits on. So McConnell is based in Montreal. This is traditional territory of the Mohawk people. And at McConnell, it's important for us not just to acknowledge this as a point of fact, but also to indicate that this strongly informs our strategic priorities around reconciliation and a reconciliation economy in Canada. And we hope that not only through the work that we're doing today, through this Leading Through Crisis piece, but all through the work that McConnell does, we're able to include reconciliation and equity elements in there. And ensure that we're addressing those systemic challenges that predate COVID, that we know have been challenging from a social perspective in Canada for so long. So we're proud to acknowledge the territory, but also important for us to recognize that it's not simply a pro forma piece, but a very important part of the work that we do. With that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Kimberly Nimrava, who's going to lead through the session and coordinate with our mentors today. Kimberly.
Thank you, Ryan, for your support and the fabulous support from the Inuweave team and the McConnell Foundation. We're at an extremely difficult stage of this pandemic right now, and I want to acknowledge the anger, the hurt, and the pain as the impacts of pre-existing racism and social inequities in our country and our communities are laid bare. There are no easy answers here, and I won't pretend that the ideas we present today can address the complexity of these issues. What I will encourage is that each of us dig deep into our most inclusive and respectful values to guide our adaptation and our rebuilding efforts, which is a focus of our webinar today. While some other people may push back, saying that given the urgency of the situation, this is not the time to apply these standards, I would disagree. In past disasters, I've seen exceptionally inclusive programs and initiatives be part of the rebuilding efforts. So continue that good work and challenge ourselves to do and apply that. In developing this webinar, we're drawing on the experience of 3 of the mentors in the Leading Through Crisis stream. These mentors will focus on 3 areas that we're repeatedly hearing from organizations as needs: framing the pandemic as a leader, supporting personnel, and fundraising. As part of the Leading Through Crisis stream, these presenters are also available to you for mentoring. This service has been offered through Inuweave to support you during this pandemic. There's no application process or fee for this support. And there are 14 mentors with a wide variety of expertise and background in disasters and emergencies available to you. You can contact the mentors directly through their profile page or ask Inuweave to match you with a mentor. The links are above and throughout the presentation. At the end of the presentation, Inaweave will also be giving some information on some of their other areas of support. Next slide. I'm very pleased to introduce our 3 mentors feature today, Jean Slick, Dale Bailey, and Duna Bailey. In preparing this webinar, I've truly appreciated the opportunity to discuss their ideas and perspectives on the challenging situation that we all find ourselves. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session where you'll have a chance to raise your hand or submit your questions through the chat stream. Our first presenter is Jean Slick. Next slide. Jean has over 30 years of experience in the disaster management field, both as a leader and an educator. During her 28-year history with the Canadian Red Cross, Jean was involved in leading response and recovery efforts for disasters in Canada and the United States, including the Edmonton tornado, Hurricanes Hugo and Andrew, Manitoba floods, and BC wildfires. In 2004, she was posted to Indonesia for 2 years as the country representative for the Canadian Red Cross tsunami recovery operations. Jean's other field experience includes work in Australia, the Caribbean, Central America, and the former Soviet Union. Jean has consulted and trained on refugee protection issues, served as an expert advisor for the BC's audit of catastrophic earthquake preparedness, and worked as a consultant for the BC government and Canadian Red Cross. Since 2009, Jean has been associate professor and program head in the Disaster and Emergency Management program at Royal Roads University. She has a PhD in interdisciplinary studies from UBC. Her current research explores how the use of digital technologies and social media are shaping the cultural characteristics of disaster response and the way these types of events are witnessed, as well as the use of painting as a research method. Very appropriate in this situation. Welcome, Jean. Next slide.
Thank you, Kimberly, and welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us from across the country. Just to situate myself, before I start, I want to let you know that I'm sitting on the traditional lands of the Koswapsum and Lekwungen nations out in near Victoria, British Columbia, just actually a little bit to the west of that. And I'm glad to be with you here today. My focus in the presentation today is to just help us think a little bit about the kind of perspective that's needed by leaders in terms of dealing with disaster and crisis situations, and in particularly in the context of the pandemic. I think one of the key differences in terms of thinking for a leader in this context is about the time perspective that we have, and that is that we really need, as leaders, to think about the longer term. And so while we, of course, need to deal with urgent actions now and whatever crisis might be at our desk today, in making decisions, though, we need to be thinking about the longer term. The second piece about leading in this kind of context is we need to give attention both to process and to the results. So how we go through this process is equally as important as the decisions that we make. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just talk for a moment about leadership decision-making in conditions of uncertainty, because that's the situation in which we're dealing with. Crisis contexts are characterized by some type of threat, a degree of uncertainty, and an urgency for action. And so we're still living in this space about uncertainty. While we know some things about the current environment, there's much that is uncertain. And so when we're in this kind of context, I'm going to offer 3 key points in terms of ways to manage. The first is it's important to document assumptions that we're making about the context in the future. And we have to make assumptions. So there's some things that we know, for example, about the nature of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the disease it causes, COVID-19. We know very little still about prevention and treatment. But we do know that in terms of this pandemic, it's going to be with us for a while. And so we can make some planning assumptions. And so one that I suggest as an example is that we're going to be needing to find a way to live with this pandemic for at least the next 18 to 24 months. So as you make assumptions, it's about the nature of the virus. It's about the effects of the virus on society in general, and there'll be different kinds of effects. There's social and behavioral effects, there's economic effects, there's broader systemic effects. And then we need from there to think about, of those different assumptions, what are the implications then for the sector that we're each working in? So I'm currently working in the post-secondary sector, so I look at it from that perspective. If you're working with communities that have Alzheimer's or dementia, then you might be looking at it from that perspective. So having those assumptions is helpful, and you will want to update those as time passes. The second piece is to clearly articulate principles, which are values and beliefs to guide decision-making. And the reason for having principles to guide decision-making is you're not going to have full information about certain aspects of the context. And so when you are facing a new situation where you don't have precedent for this in the past, then by having principles, you can apply that principle. So for example, a principle could be relating to holding the health and safety of employees and clients as utmost. Another principle would be recognizing that risk and vulnerability are different for both employees and clients. The third piece here is then to think about that potential outcome and to develop a number of scenarios. And I'm giving you 3 examples here about types of scenarios, but you'll want to develop scenarios in your own context. And this is thinking about the longer term. So if you think out for at least 2 or 3 years, what is it that you would like to have at the end of this time? What are some potential scenarios? One is to return to the status quo, and that is actually not advised. And I'll come back to why in just a sec. Another scenario might be survive and thrive. We're going to survive, get through this, but we want to be thriving as an organization. Another potential scenario is you need to do some radical revisioning. So the context of living with the threats that we're dealing with, the pandemic threats, are such that we're going to be living with, as I mentioned this, for at least the next 18 to 24 months. Of the past pandemics in this century, only one has ever been managed by a vaccine, and that vaccine only came in after the peak. So while we want to be hopeful and optimistic about the future, we also need to be pragmatic and recognize that we can't just plan on hope, and that we also need to envision that we might be living with COVID for some period of time, and even after there's a vaccine, that we may still be living with COVID in society. So given that, if we're going to need to be living in this adapted situation, what is that new normal that we would like to see in the future going forward? And what will that look like for our organizations? And it'll be different based on sector. Some organizations that have very hands-on connection with clients are going to have to envision doing work in a different way. But we want to think about what's doable and sustainable. So the sooner that we can find a way to transition to what I will call a new normal, the better, because then we mitigate the risks about future waves with this virus. It may be possible in the future to return to some forms of normal as we know it now, and certainly as in society as things are opening up, we're seeing that happen. But we will be continued to face with, if it's not this threat, then other threats like this in the future. So I will just conclude there and pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Next slide. Thanks, Jean. I just, I think that there's so much meat in there that I'm sure people would have much more questions for you. And I think that reminder of that process, being aware of the process as well as the product, if you will, is a good place to start. Our next speaker is Dale Bailey. Dale's focus is community investment, where he's worked in the health, social, disaster, sport, recreation, and education sectors. He served as senior manager and governance volunteer in local, provincial, and national organizations. Dale's early career developing life-saving programs and teaching lifeguarding led him to a lifetime of finding innovative approaches to inspire community generosity. For more than 30 years, he's helped organizations reach and exceed their fundraising goals. Dale currently works for YMCA Calgary. Over to you, Dale.
I will tell you my story of community investment, starting at the YMCA over 40 years ago, and then returning to the Y this last year. So let's start with the current state. So I was temporarily laid off April and May, and I was just hired back to work. The reason I was hired back is because, well, I never really stopped communicating with donors, YMCA leadership, my YMCA colleagues, my charity colleagues, my mentors, or what I call listening partners. I've participated in many webinars and signed up as a mentor for Interweave. I continue to seek advice, and in return, I give advice. I recently secured a significant donation from a family that enabled the YMCA to reimagine our summer day camps. We've leveraged this donation in our conversation with governments, corporations, and foundations, and have challenged our donors and members to contribute to this matching family donation. Okay, let's travel back now over the years and talk about some of my observations, learnings, and actions. And I'll do this in 3 segments. Number 1, a generosity dialogue. 2 will be generosity for charities, and 3 will be generosity learnings. Next slide, please. Generosity dialogue. Well, fundraising is about creating stories, having others tell your story and tell their stories. It's about having a dialogue. Fundraising is also about seeking advice, not asking for money. Because if you ask for money, you usually get advice. Listen more than talk. Connecting ideas with passionate people. Leverage every conversation. Who can you be introduced to? How do you match contributions and donations every time? Are we providing our supporters with meaningful engagements and experiences? Do they meet beneficiaries? Do we ask for money or do we provide opportunities? And do we have mentors or listening partners? Next slide, please. Generosity for charities. Well, we've seen lots of corporations step up. Here's some examples. Well, right out of the gate, Canadian Tire stepped up, Dove, Subaru, they've donated millions to help frontline workers and to feed the homeless. Next slide, please. We've seen charities like Food Bank Canada and Frontline Fund, which includes all the hospital foundations, and the Government of Canada quickly collaborate to maximize benefit to food banks, hospital frontline workers, and communities. The total benefit from these corporations and collaborations alone is over $500 million and growing. Next slide, please. Here's some generosity learnings or some perspectives. Imagine Canada predicts that charities in Canada will lose $4.2 billion to $6.3 billion in revenue this year, and possibly up to 195,000 staff positions may be lost. Therefore, the proposal to the Government of Canada was $10 billion, and so far the result has been $350 million that I mentioned earlier, and the CERB and wage subsidy programs. The demand for charity is on hold, but it's building, and we're in for the largest comeback in history, as a Black Bart seminar that I was on May 27th. Keep fundraising though, because as your new learnings that are currently working and your old successes will better prepare you for breakthrough results. The most impactful change now in fundraising is no face-to-face activity. Therefore, online fundraising with emails and videos are providing charities in Canada with lots of promising results. Let's look at change in the narrative and what does this mean for us going forward? Well, we'll be not turning on a switch, but we're going to turn a dial towards a new normal, and we'll be staging this new normal. Edit your language accordingly. Don't overuse phrases such as unprecedented, uncharted, and pivot. We will be something towards this new normal, reopening, relaunching, re-engaging, renewing, recovering, remobilizing, and reimagining. We will need to seek and secure collaborative initiatives among charities. We, three sectors of public, private, and volunteer will be working as one, a community, as we have in common the same vulnerabilities, we serve community, and we're seeking and securing opportunities. We will be organizing our daily work and fundraising differently. Technology, turning the dial, and communication will need to become essential tools. I want to conclude today with a tale of two fundraisers that I want to renew your optimism and your passion for fundraising. On May 24th, Capital One's The Match was played on TV, one of the first comeback sporting events featuring two golf pros, Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson, and two football pros, Tom Brady and Peyton Manning. The event was a fundraiser for COVID-19 with 4 prominent charities as the recipients. Well, it was entertaining golf with high quality and a close match that was won by one stroke. And many pro athletes in golf and football donated on the phone through challenges and bets. The immediate needs of the 4 charities were well presented throughout the show. And oh, by the way, they raised $20 million. For sure, a pilot show for anyone who hopes to televise or stream a sporting event as we work through this pandemic. On April 6th, Captain Tom Moore of Britain set out to raise 1,000 British pounds by walking laps in his garden. He planned to reach his goal in 24 days on April 30th, his 100th birthday. He quickly became a hero by raising 39 million British pound, or it's 66.3 million Canadian. But he raised more than money for NHS Charities Together, which is a group of 250 charities. Captain Tom inspired people. He brought everyone together. He provided assurances that the clouds will go away. Now, Captain Sir Tom Moore as of May 20th. The moral of this story, and there are these two extremes of fundraising events and everything between, but look at what one person can do and what the difference they can make. Now, I'd like to know your ideas, learnings, and advice, and please email me at dale.bailey@gmail.com. All the best, stay safe, and be well. And oh, by the way, my story is continuing for many years. What's your story, and how will it progress? Thank you.
Thanks, Dale. Thanks very much. I love that story of Captain Tom. I think we all find it inspiring. And it's good to hear that, some of the old tried and true methods still work while we're all adapting and whatever our organizations for the future. Our third speaker today is Duna Bayley. Duna has worked with over 300 groups as a consultant and facilitator, including the Alberta Network for Immigrant Women, Action Committee Against Violence and Volunteer, Alberta. She has extensive experience in community development and engagement, particularly in the areas of education, justice, leadership, and the not-for-profit sector. Her work with social justice coalitions, designing and facilitating collaborative processes, was one of the highlights of her career. Duna's passion for coaching, teaching, and sharing her learning in sport, leadership, and literacy has shaped her commitment to youth and to the community. She's also served in volunteer leadership roles with Calgary Learns, Leadership Edmonton, and the Life Saving Society, among others. Duna's training in community development and the ecology of human learning is from Cultural Affairs Canada and the Human Venture Institute. So we asked Duna to distill the 3 decades of experience on the people side of the situation into this short presentation. I'll turn it over to you now, Duna.
Thank you, Kimberly. Hello, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts and observations. Next slide, please. With the sheer uncertainty and scope of this pandemic, it's important to take care of ourselves and the people in our organization. The lost sense of security and normalcy can trigger grief, and with it, feelings of shock, denial, anger, and depression. A bias toward maintaining control may be a natural response to the crisis, but it risks shutting off awareness of our feelings and emotional needs. When we aren't aware of our own feelings, we can't help others. I was definitely one of those people who went into control freak mode, stressing everyone out, including myself. I was exhausted. I had to step back, trust others, and identify and name what I was feeling, and then develop a schedule to adopt daily rituals for self-care: healthy eating, deep breathing, exercise, meditation, and emotional self-connection. Take a moment for deep breathing when you notice rising fear or stress, and likewise before making big decisions. Communicate often and be sensitive to fears and stress, especially when talking to people who are worried about their job. Decide how to best deliver information and when. One organization held a staff meeting and announced that one of the new hires would be brought back to work with no forewarning or rationale for the decision. Some of the other staff who had not been recalled and had worked there for several years felt slighted. This led to a flurry of phone calls after the meeting to ease the discomfort and anger. Whatever information you give, it is reassuring for people to let them know you are accessing timely data from credible sources and not just anecdotal information or rumor. Your employees may feel lost, as many find a sense of community at their workplaces. The coffee room chats, people's workspaces with a row of colored trolls and knickknacks are gone. People may have their own informal networks, but to ensure no one is isolated, you may choose to formalize these by assigning staff into small teams that have the responsibility just to check in with each other to see how they're doing. You may also need to prepare staff for a move back to full or partial closure, depending on how things move out or play out. Next slide, please. Accountability can be a challenge, especially if you have avoided having those difficult conversations or are worried about adding stress. Some staff working from home may not be used to this kind of independent work or working remotely on teams. Holding staff accountable for their work will be more and more important as your organization responds to the needs of the community. Be empathetic to your staff needs while also being clear about goals and expectations. By developing accountability processes together, it will increase commitment for success, create a sense of clarity and confidence. You will need to be flexible if you are addressing lack of performance. Talk about why this is happening and then work together to figure out the best way to resolve the issue. Cross-boundary work is needed for complex challenges. You may need to restructure and diversify working teams to support not only accountability, but agility. One executive director asked her program leaders to identify alternative ways to provide service, but there were significant gaps in their plans. Instead of having her program leaders work in isolation, she facilitated a planning session for them to identify and develop ideas to deal with common challenges. Also, adding someone with expertise in health and safety, legal, or technical into the team can help cover some of those gaps. Next slide, please. Culture is how you interact, learn, make decisions, communicate, how receptive you are to change, innovation, and risk-taking, who gets listened to, and who gets recognized. During this pandemic, we're all experiencing similar vulnerabilities: sense of loss, job, health, and family concerns. This impacts how we interact with others. It certainly forced me to step back and reflect on the quality of my thinking, relationships, and life in general, as I'm sure many have. And it also presents an opportunity for organizations to rethink and perhaps change their work culture for the better. You could ask questions such as, where are people satisfied or dissatisfied with how they work together? What is different now? What is worth keeping and what can we leave behind? How do we deal with elephants in the room? How receptive have we been to new ideas in the past? How might we need to reframe concepts such as experimentation, failure, and change? How do we manage risk as we test new ways of doing things? A small change that one group made was to rethink their meetings. They're meeting more often with only 1 or 2 critical items on the agenda. Similar to the community, they adopted a more staged approach to solution finding and added contingency plans. Turf battles were set aside, and they're relying on expertise and inclusion rather than rank. To increase your capacity and build an adaptive organization, You need to institutionalize and prioritize reflection and continuous learning. Webinars and resources can be shared. Scheduling regular learning meetings or developing individualized learning plans are some ideas to create an empowering learning environment. There will be countless stories of what we have learned from this pandemic and how we have adapted. We need to learn from our successes as well as our failures. Make the time to use this learning to prepare for future disruptions and build resilience into your organization and your people. Despair is not an option. We can get wrapped up in the problems this pandemic creates and feel paralyzed and unsure of how to proceed. As a community, we're exploring our way forward, step by step, readjusting and continuing to learn. Take the time to celebrate your efforts thus far. Thank you and take care.
Duna, thank you so much. I know there was a lot of really good content, good reminders and ideas as to how we can support our people at this time. I really appreciate also that you're taking, that you remind us to take the time to celebrate and recognize how hard people are working and just how big a challenge this is in so many ways for our teams. Next slide, please. So we're now going to move on to the question and answer session. This is an opportunity for those of you on the line to chime in with any questions you may have for our mentors. We have Jean, Slick, Dale, and Duna, and just questions about what they presented or anything else that that comes to mind for you. Just looking at the chat stream here, or feel free to raise your hand and Ryan can watch out for that. Don't have any questions yet.
Kimberly, it's Ryan. I actually have one for Dale. If I could jump in, if I could cut the line.
Absolutely.
So Dale, I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about how actually sort of how to approach potential donors with empathy in this situation, because it's a crisis everybody is experiencing, right? It's not just charities that are feeling this space, but it's actually everybody. And you mentioned sort of the gradual change in the narrative. How does that sort of play out from the donors or funders perspective?
Thanks, Ryan. Hi, everybody. Yeah, again, I have what's I call a generosity dialogue. I don't go in to give advice, or I don't go in to ask money. I just want to have a generosity dialogue, and I really emphasize that word. And I'll go back to the family that I spoke to 3 weeks ago, because I knew they wanted to do something, because they knew people in Calgary and members of the Calgary YMCA were hurting and were going to hurt for quite some time. So we had a dialogue, and that it really was a dialogue. We talked about what we had in common as far as fitness, business, family, grandchildren, what we were currently doing, what our current fears and concerns and vulnerabilities were. And then we spoke about the why, and realizing that it was going to be a different summer for sure for families, because he felt that families were going to be very stressed out because they've been spending so much time together, and kids have never experienced this before. And he realized we weren't able to run day camps. I said we were looking at ways to recreate these camps. We know we're going to lose money because we won't have the traditional revenue stream. He said, well, what if I could help out? So therefore, the idea was born. The idea was born that he would put a significant donation from the family forward, and that he wanted us to utilize that with our conversations to leverage with government, foundations, and corporations. But we also wanted to put it up as a match to encourage our members to participate. So that's how that conversation worked. We both had lots of empathy for each other and lots of other people, but you're right, that was the emphasis of having the what I call generosity dialogue. And so far we've been raising quite a bit of money, and we are going ahead with a different kind of a outdoor camp experience this summer.
Great. Thanks, Dale. We have questions coming in thick and fast right now, so I'm going to start with a couple for Jean. Amanda is requesting that you can elaborate on defining the desired outcome, status quo versus survive and thrive versus radical revisioning.
Sure, I can talk about those. And let me just say that those are three possible types of outcomes. So you might want to think about different ways of framing that for your own organization. But if I use those as examples, the return to status quo is essentially trying to get back to normal. And historically in disaster contexts, we've recognized that disasters and crises are an opportunity to find a space for a new normal. And so when we think about survive and thrive or radical revisioning, we are looking towards what that new normal might be. There's also some assumptions underlying different scenarios. For example, if we think about returning to status quo, that scenario assumes that the effects of the pandemic, while sustained, are essentially short-lived and that we're going to all bounce back. And there's lots to suggest that we may be living with COVID for a period of time and certainly for a couple of years. And then we need to say, is return to normal as it was before possible or desirable? And so one of the considerations there is there's things that left us vulnerable as organizations to the effects of a pandemic. And so we want to be prepared not only for future managing this pandemic, future pandemics, but also other kinds of events and disasters that might hit our communities. So the ability to survive and thrive is not just with the pandemic context, but also for any other disasters. So if you're in an area that has wildfires or floods, being able to deal with that as well. So trying to find ways of being more resilient as an organization.
That's great. Thanks, Jean. And I think it also addresses something that a couple of people have requested, which is, a bit more detail on why returning to the status quo is not really desirable. And it is, without being overly optimistic, it really is that opportunity to re-envision and improve and reduce our vulnerability to future disasters, as you summarized so well. So Matt's wondering, what's been the biggest surprise in terms of a process or a system or a practice that you'd already put in place or an organization had put in place prior to COVID that you didn't think would be as impactful as it came to be? And I'm just going to turn to Duna and see if anything comes to mind and then open it up to the other mentors.
I think one of the things that comes to mind is just the fact that we had formalized our learning processes before. And so we had already had conversations around how do we build an adaptive organization through our learning. So we would bring resources to meetings constantly and talk about, how does this apply to our work? What are the impacts if we tried to apply it? How might we apply it? And so we had already sort of prepared ourselves for those kind of conversations and for adapting. So we had this mindset of not staying static and always growing.
Neat. Anything to add? That's great. Anything to add to that, Jean or Dale?
I think that's a great example that Duna provided. I'll just leave it there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same here. Yeah.
It's that mindset. It's that mindset that is just so valuable. Gabrielle was wondering, she has a very small store that's connected with Shigamek, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, charity. It's been closed for 3 months, just moved. How would I connect with them again? How would you reopen that arrangement? Maybe Dale could respond to that.
I guess what kind of store? First question is, I'm wondering what they're selling. Is there any way that the products relate to people's current needs?
I'm selling. I'm a small I'm like a 10 by 10 room. I had just moved from a bigger place to a smaller place. And I sell children's clothing and toys that have been used. And I go through it and package them into big packages. And with Chitimic, if I get donations that people donate their products or stuff they don't need anymore, I package that and I donate it to children of Chitimic. Now, Chitimic is for the indigenous, but it's also a charity for, you don't have to be Indian, you can be white there too. And it's a big place up here in Midland, Ontario. They're a great unit to work with. So I've been with them for over a year now. And with the pandemic, I had to close, I had to move. I was told I needed to move. So I moved back into my original space with my sister who owns a hair salon. So I rent out the back portion of her salon. And then I've got stuff filtered through her store. So I'm gonna be there until I pay off some of my debt. And then hopefully I will find a bigger, better place in probably a year or so. So I have had connections with Cecile, who is the head honcho there for Chitimic, and they have just recently moved into a brand new building. So I'm not sure if I should email her or call her or go there. I'm not quite sure how to set that up anymore.
Well, I would phone or email, however you decide to get a hold of her, whatever's worked in the past. But I guess what comes to mind is childcare centers opening up again. So is there, and that would seem to be a good audience market for people to purchase the product and also be generous and think about helping a charity out besides helping their own needs out. So I'm not sure in your area what the status is or the stage is of childcare centers opening, whether it's a YMCA, a private one or whatever, but that's the first thing that comes to mind to me.
Okay.
And Gabrielle, I mean, that's a great question. And I'd certainly, encourage you, if, don't hesitate to follow up with Dale offline. You can,
okay.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thanks. Good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll get to email again after.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, it'll be in the PowerPoint, just for anyone that when the PowerPoint is put up after the presentation on the InnoWeave site, the emails and the links are on there. Jen has a question for Jean on how we create plans to ensure that the new processes and procedures they put in place are sustainable for the longer term. And she appreciating the reminders about envisioning in that longer term lens.
Great question, Jen. Well, what we want to do is to think, that's where looking at this, the sort of future is thinking about the current context in which we're working and what our assumptions are about the future state. And then trying to work with, and I would say it needs to be done collaboratively, and Duna might have some thoughts on this as well, about working collaboratively with folks within your organization who know it the best, who know the organization well, to think through about what would sustainability look like. But I want to offer a word of caution here, because quite often in a disaster context, we plan based on the most recent event. So if it was a fire, we plan based on a fire. If it was a flood, we plan based on a flood. If it's a pandemic, we plan based on the pandemic. What we want to do is make sure that we're planning to be resilient for a range of threats going forward. And so I would say a key about thinking about sustainability in this context is thinking about the duration of the pandemic and what does it mean to be sustainable in that context. But I would also say, what are the other key threats? And this depends on where you live. How was the organization vulnerable prior to the pandemic? What might future vulnerabilities and risks be? And lay those out. And then when you're building and thinking about what sustainable options might be, you're considering all of those things, and you're not just responding to this pandemic. Pandemics have been a known threat, and so it's highly probable that there will be another one as well, and it could be different in terms of its characteristics. But this one's been a good test for us to learn from. So I would say in terms of sustainability, a key piece there is thinking about the diversity of threats that each individual organization is facing, both prior to and now, and then thinking about what options might be in the long term. But I think Duna could actually elaborate quite a bit more in terms of some of the process pieces. So I'll pass it over.
Yeah, I think you talked about collaboration being important as you go into the future. And one of the key things around collaborating together is being willing to give up some of your control and power, and also coming to a common vision and sharing that vision and making sure everyone understands what it takes to achieve that vision. So in some of the collaborations I've worked in, that was really the most important thing up front, is establishing that common vision and then identifying all of the assets and all of the pieces that would need to be done in order to achieve that vision. I think the other piece is always engaging people in the process. So who you bring into that collaboration is important, and that might change as time goes on, as you learn how you might be missing some important pieces of information or some key organizations that might provide a certain service. So those are just two things that would help, I think.
Thanks, Duna. I think, you know, that taking the time to put in that common vision in place, and Jean mentioned something fairly quickly that I'd really like to just flag for people, is that as we move ahead with this, there is a real tendency to prepare perfectly for the last disaster. So as you move ahead, make sure that you're considering other risks that you have in your geography and for your sector, as well as you know, watching out for that trap, because I pretty much guarantee that you'll see it. Alana is wondering, and maybe we can turn this over to Dale, but also I'd invite Ryan to speak to it. Smaller organizations, what there are suggestions are to navigate short-term fundraising challenges, particularly for the organizations that aren't frontline, but are related more to bridge building and capacity building. Dale.
Well, first thing that comes to mind is what the government of Canada did with $350 million. They spread it among 3 organizations: United Way, Red Cross, Canadian Red Cross, and the foundations, Canadian foundations in Canada. And each of them have, I don't know, about $100 and some thousand, and now they're spreading it out to their local branches, and they've all got programs. So I don't know if you have a relationship with any of those 3 organizations locally, but they will all have funds right now which they need to disperse. And I understand in my discussions the last week with organizations applying for those is that they realize that we're all at different stages, and they may be able to give the money out for a prolonged period of time. It may be something that you're needing to do now or in 12 months from now. So I would encourage you to look at those 3 organizations and see what if anything, applies. That's just my first thought. Again, you're welcome to follow up with me after, but on the spur of the moment, that's what I got.
And Ryan, I know that InnoWeave has well, part of the InnoWeave Leading Through Crisis is a wonderful list of links, resources. But anything else you can add there?
Yeah, those resources are up on innoweave.ca, where we're trying our best to keep up with, you know, at least giving one place where you can come and see everything that's being rolled out across the sector. So there are private philanthropic responses that are coming out to this, as well as the public ones that Dale had mentioned. And I would say broaden the target a little bit. There's probably a lot of things that are being written as COVID response right now, but there's also probably a lot of other program architecture out there that may have been made more flexible or more responsive as a part of COVID that could be useful for the space that you're in. So look for those flexibilities, not just necessarily the pieces that are tagged as COVID.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you. We've only got about another minute or so for questions. I'll try to get a couple more through. Paul asks, organizations are changing structures on the fly. How do we ensure managers understand these changes to direct things effectively? And just Jean or maybe Duna, any comments on that?
I can jump in. I think that the biggest thing in helping people understand the changes that you're going through is to engage them in the process. So if you're planning in isolation and then you hand it down to them, it's much more difficult to have them buy into it and have them understand the reason why you need to restructure. Also, as you do the restructuring, it's important to provide feedback loops to monitor how it's working so that you can again adjust and adapt to what the needs are. Jean?
The only other thing I would add, Duna, is just transparency. It's really important in situations like this to say what you know. People can deal with information, even if it's difficult information. But what's really hard is not having information. And so be as transparent as you can, say what you know, say what you don't know, and invite people to help.
And that I think that's just going to close us off here. I realize we didn't get to everybody, I'm sorry, but again, do feel free to follow up with the mentors. There's other mentors that you can talk to or link to these mentors that are part of the Leading Through Crisis stream. And I will just turn it over. I see that Jen Helpby Ferguson provided some information on some of the funding streams that have been referred to. Thank you, Jen. And I'll turn it over to Ryan to give us some further information on Interweave and close the session for us. Thank you so much to all our mentors.
Yeah, thank you to everybody who's joined, and very much to Kimberly and the mentorship team. It's phenomenal to have you online, and I think we're seeing through these sessions that that it really just gives a taste of all the interesting information that is available through the mentors, and that organizations may want to be able to access one-on-one. So we've got this link here that's hopefully live and accessible through the Zoom, but as Kimberly mentioned, will also be sent out with a piece afterwards, where you can go and see the bios of the mentors who are available. This is on interweave.ca. The coaching stream is called Leading Through Crisis, and our mentors are listed there, and you're free to contact them, and they're able to give you one-on-one mentoring sessions that Interweave is covering the time for. And we really do encourage individuals to access those resources and use them. There's also micro coaching available on Interweave, which is if you're an organization that needs strategic advice on your measurement plan or your enterprise plan or things that are a little bit more conventionally in the Interweave space. Some of our coaches on those lines are also available and accessible on the website. In fact, we've got a couple of them joining on our chat today, and I'm sure they'd be happy to connect with you and provide any advice they can also offer. So those are the two main sort of immediate resources that are available on Interweave. And in the coming weeks, we're going to be rolling out some additional webinars and hoping to offer some support for organizations as we move into the re-stage, as we're rebuilding and reimagining, but also understanding that that organizations are still coming from a space of significant crisis and some significant damage that's been done. So starting to work with organizations to think about how we start approaching those horizons, and there'll continue to be Interweave support available as we go through that journey. So thank you to everybody for joining. We weren't able to get to every question today, but I really do encourage those who may have more detailed questions to reach out to a mentor. And once again, best wishes to everybody, and thank you for joining.